get going. So again, just a quick housekeeping note for those of you who are joining or already on, please do remain on mute during this presentation so we don't accidentally interrupt anything. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Mila. I'm the Assistant Store Manager for the Kohler Signature Store in Bethesda by GROF USA. We are very excited today to be able to welcome Mr. Don Ruggles all the way from Colorado. He is an architect at the Ruggles Mabe Studio and, of course, the author of Beauty, Neuroscience, and Architecture. That is what we will be discussing today. In his book, he does blend science and architectural principles to challenge the thought that beauty cannot be judged objectively. So we can't wait to hear what he has to say, and it looks like he's ready to go. So, Don, take it away.
Well, thank you. I'm quite honored to have this opportunity to present this today. This was the second time that I presented in Washington, D.C. About a year and a half ago, I was invited to present at the Georgetown Club by Restore Media. And I've got some really great friends in Washington, D.C. and the architecture profession. I always love visiting the city, and I think I'm missing that as part of this, but our new reality, of course, is Zoom and digital presentations. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity. So I'm going to give a talk today that I've been giving here in the US and occasionally in Europe for over 10 years, and I continue to work on it as new research becomes available to me. And everywhere I go, I'm met with the same reaction, and that's amazement at the fact that beauty can play such an important role in our lives, especially in regards to our health and well-being. And this message is especially important today, given the health and societal issues that we're having to confront recently. And it's resulted in unprecedented stress on our society, and also it's initiated stressors on us individually that has affected our health and sense of well-being. So I'm going to get right to the point here and open with a rather remarkable statement by a research doctor from the University of Texas School of Medicine. And I quote, "Architects and designers have a greater ability to improve public health than medical professionals," end quote. It's stunning to realize that what we design could have such a broad and profound effect on our health. And how is it that we as professionals can have such an effect on public health? Well, the answer to that question is we have the ability to influence positively our clients' subliminal neurological processing, which in turn has a positive effect on our health and well-being. And following from that statement, here's something interesting to ponder. What if I told you that this is all initiated by viewing basic geometric patterns? Today, I'll demonstrate how that's possible. For centuries, humankind has sought to express beauty in art and architecture. Today, neuroscience is helping us to know more about beauty and to understand how and why beauty can play such an important role in our lives. So, as previously mentioned, the talk of today's title is Beauty, Neuroscience, and Architecture, Timeless Patterns and Their Impact on Our Well-Being. So I want you to think of today's talk as being in the form of a three-part symphony, using a musical analogy. The opening is a fast-paced section where I will identify three basic concepts of neuroscience as related to art and architecture. That's followed by a more lyric section where we will look at beautiful architecture and art from around the world and connect it to a very important pattern that I think everyone listening will identify with. The final section concludes with a definition of beauty that weaves these concepts together with our health and well-being. And there's an encore that will be a short video highlighting some of these concepts. And along the way, I'll share some personal experiences that helped inform much of the science that I've been researching. I'll start today's talk with a question. Have you ever experienced a room that is unsettling? One that overwhelms your senses to the point of discomfort? Did you sense you had to leave as quickly as possible? Additionally, are there buildings or works of art that you routinely go out of your way to avoid? Conversely, have you ever been in a room that you didn't want to leave? Was it a space that calmed you and made you feel whole and nourished, even hopeful? Have you known a building or a piece of art that you went out of your way to engage with on a routine basis? A more general question is, are we subconsciously aware of buildings or art that we routinely approach or avoid? This is the power of architecture and design at work, and neuroscience is unlocking the ideas of art and architecture that have such an effect on us, whether positive or negative, and why they do. Frankly, it's an instinctual value that we all share, our drive to achieve good health and well-being. Think of it this way: when you're ill, your primary focus is to regain your health. Or when you're under stress, your primary goal is to relieve the stress. This is common to all cultures, to all humans. It's beautiful is a phrase that we routinely hear every day. It describes a quiet scene from nature, a moment of personal triumph. My grandson, I heard all about this several times. Joyous events such as weddings or the birth of a baby. That's not my daughter, by the way. The majesty of a mountain range. That's a scene just outside of Aspen, here in Colorado. And sunrises or sunsets, and that just names a few. It's beautiful is an intuitive, emotional response that implies inspiration, wonderment, awe, and curiosity, and at its most fundamental, a sense of pleasure. Yet this phrase has all but disappeared from the world of art and architecture. It's been marginalized to the point where it's seen as a romantic notion from a bygone era. That is until recently, when neuroscience started to unlock the mysteries of the brain and show us just how important the emotion of beauty is to our health and well-being. So the origin of this talk goes back actually to the early 1970s for me, and it's really a tale of two houses. So the first house I designed and built in Aspen in 1970, and the owners had moved in, and I was standing in the great room, and a neighbor walked in, first time that she'd ever been in the house, and it was fully furnished, so it was a completed house. And she walked in and saw me standing there and looked at me and looked around and said, "Well, this is absolutely beautiful." So I was basically 20 years old. I had no idea what she was talking about. I didn't know if it was the view or the cabinetry or the stonework or the paint colors. I had no idea. I could tell by the look on her face and the tone of her voice that it was a positive comment. So, but upon reflecting, I just wasn't sure what she was referring to. Well, fast forward about a year and a half, and I built another house outside of Denver, a magnificent building site, and I used many of the ideas from the first house and the second house, and I was invited to an event by the owners to celebrate their moving in. So I attend the event, and what happened that evening was quite unique. People were asking me, "Why did you do this? Why did you do that?" And the comments were, "This is really exciting, and this is really interesting and quite different," and not one comment about beauty. And I left that event thinking, well, why would one house create one reaction and another house an entirely different reaction? Well, that question stayed with me unanswered, frankly, because I was too busy running a business, until 2009, when I was asked to give a talk here in Denver for a fundraiser, and the theme of the talk was timeless design. And my research for the talk led me to the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. That's an organization funded by the American Institute of Architects. It's based in San Diego at the Salk Institute. Well, what I found there was completely eye-opening. And some of what I'm sharing today is research that came out of that institute. Well, here's a quote from one of the most famous architects of our time, Renzo Piano, taken from a recent interview. And there are a couple of things that are quite unique about this quote. The first is a modernist architect using the word beauty. Don't hear that too often. And second is his usage of the word emotions. This implies that he's familiar with information and ideas coming out of the neuroscience world, which leads us to the first of the three neurological concepts important to today's talk. Here we have a cross-section of a typical brain, and most scientists segment the brain into three major regions. The first region is the brainstem, which is at the base of our cranium and the top of our spinal cord. Then there is the midbrain, which is immediately adjacent and, as the name implies, in the center of our brain. Well, these two regions together equal the ancient brain that evolved with humankind over what scientists think 5 million years. This is the brain that our ancestors lived with as they evolved on the eastern plains of Africa, known as the savannah. What's important for today's talk is to know that the ancient brain is the center of emotions, and that emotional thought happens subliminally without us even being aware of it. Then wrapping over the ancient brain is the third segment, the modern brain, the neocortex, believed to have evolved in the most recent 1 million years, or even less, depending on which scientist you talk to. And what's important to know about the modern brain is that it's the center of rational thought and feelings. Thus, to explain this diagram, emotions happen instinctually and subliminally in the ancient brain. And it isn't until the modern brain is activated that we are aware that the emotion is occurring. That awareness is known as a feeling. This is often referred to as bottom-up processing versus top-down processing. Emotions balanced against rational thought. Well, here's a stunning fact for you to consider. 11 million bits of information per second, that's 11 million per second, enters the ancient brain from our nervous system. 50 of those bits per second are passed on to the modern brain and become feelings. Clearly, our ancient brain is the neurological component that directs our actions and makes our lives possible. Well, it turns out that exciting and beautiful, the two terms associated with the home site design, are feelings that are the result of neurological inputs that are genetically encoded into our DNA. They are part of our genetic memory that we were born with. And these feelings are related to the two essential emotions of life: survival and pleasure. At the most fundamental level, humankind genetically predisposed to seek two things: survival and pleasure. Every day, our bodies process billions of actions without us being aware of it. All of them are geared towards these two goals. An amazing 99% of all actions processed by our brains are intuitive and subconscious, and all are geared to emotions of survival and pleasure. Well, there are two very, very important feelings that result from emotions of survival and pleasure. Those are avoid and approach. A good example of these feelings are, I imagine each of you have said at one time or another, you know, I just don't feel like going there anymore. I don't know why, I just don't. Or conversely, I love going there. It's hard to put into words, but I just love it there. Well, these are subconscious emotions becoming feelings related to survival and pleasure. And this is an important part of my talk today, so hold on to that thought now as we move on. Now, this brings us to the second neurological
Kevin, estoy en mi coche. Si necesitas, avísame. Ten mucho cuidado cuando muevas esto.
Any idea? Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Now, this brings us to the second neurological concept important to today's talk. Neuroscientists have determined that our brains specialize in pattern recognition. This too has to do with millions of years of our evolution. As Nico Salangeros has theorized, those of our ancestors on the savannah where mankind evolved who most readily recognized repeating patterns were the ones who survived. Literally, pattern recognition equals survival and pleasure. A good example of this would be a dark sky filled with lightning, wind, and rain equals stress and survival. This is a pattern to avoid. While a bright sky filled with sun combined with blossoms on a tree led to food and pleasure is a pattern to approach. Or another example would be jagged rocks and a cliff was a pattern to avoid. A green meadow with water was a pattern to approach. Or yet another example, a thorny bush was a pattern to approach, a flowering bush. A thorny bush was a pattern to avoid, and a flowering bush was a pattern to approach. Well, continuing the pattern discussion, here we have a profile of the class of the face, which we all know. But upon closer viewing, we realize it's actually the profiles of two faces opposing one another. Our brains are literally switching back and forth, attempting to decide what it is and attempting to decide is it approachable or avoidable. This is typical of how we regard everything we view every day. Our brain is constantly on guard for our survival and also seeking pleasure, approach or avoid. So patterns play an important role in our lives. Well, a floor plan is a pattern, as is a building elevation, and a painting is a pattern, and a broad view is a pattern as well. In fact, everything we view, everything in our visual field, is known quite simply as a pattern. And because survival and pleasure are the two drivers in our DNA, then humankind over time started to place repeating patterns into one of these categories. And these repeating patterns over millions of years during our evolution became genetically encoded into our DNA. And as a result, they were passed on from generation to generation, resulting in a common instinctual set of emotions that we all share. Well, each pattern we view is dominated by either approach or avoid. This doesn't mean, though, that there aren't components of each in our view, only that there will eventually be a dominant response. So I'm going to click through a few patterns here. Well, as I click through these patterns, your brain was instantaneously and subliminally decided, is that a threat or is that approachable? Next, I'm going to show you a few examples of familiar patterns that we react emotionally to and discuss what the feelings are that are attached to these emotions. Now, before I show these next slides, I want to ask that you pay attention to how you immediately feel when the slide's projected. Not what you think of the slide, but rather simply how you feel. Well, this is a pleasure response originating in our evolution. When our ancestors came upon a view such as this, it would be stress relieving due to food and shelter being available. They knew that this was a good environment to raise offspring. Rolling hills and verdant countryside that signaled food and water. Sparsely spaced trees were preferred because predators couldn't hide out. A long view to observe enemies coming and an open sky to observe the weather. It is approachable. It signals pleasure. Incidentally, our clients often have an unexplainable emotional attachment to a view of this type. The reason for this is that it is encoded into their DNA as a pleasure-inducing pattern. Well, the next image generally creates a different emotional response. Clients conversely have an emotional reaction to this pattern as well. However, it's survival and avoidance reaction. This is identifying a dangerous situation and pattern. Well, here's another pleasure approach pattern, a tree canopy, perhaps one of the first places of refuge for humankind, signaling stress relief and a feeling of safety. Well, here's a current day pleasure and approach pattern that signals protection and draws you in with familiar geometric patterns and colors that are similar to the tree canopy. A strong sense of centers and boundaries, natural colors that we intuitively relate to, soft lights so we're not blinded and can see properly, and it generally has a welcoming, understandable geometry, so our subconscious isn't preoccupied with trying to figure out what it is and determine if it's a threat. There's no stress involved for your brain to process this scene. It is approachable. Well, here's an architectural comparison that contains both pattern types, an approach geometric pattern combined with an avoidance geometric pattern. Now notice how the avoidance pattern in the new construction overwhelms the approach pattern in the original building, as your subconscious attempts to categorize this form. I suspect that most of you didn't even notice the older building sitting under the new construction as you attempted to decide if this is a threat or should be avoided. And because there are conflicting patterns here, this scene is inherently more difficult for your brain to process, which is stress-inducing. Well, here's an image that contains both approach patterns and avoidance patterns as well. Now, normally a table full of food and wine and cheese in a meadow adjacent to a body of water would be an approach pattern. Yet the lightning has turned this into an avoidance pattern. And notice that no one's sitting at the table. They probably all run for the car. Here, the survival instinct dominates over the approach instinct. The purpose of showing these last two slides is to show how the avoidance survival instinct overwhelms the approach instinct. Neuroscientists theorize that the avoidance survival instinct is actually 5 to 7 times stronger than the approach pleasure instinct. Why? Because nature prepares us first for survival, then asks questions later.
You know that limestone base that everybody puts and then they put other color around it?
This is an important fact to remember as we look into the next step of this concept. The third neurological concept is we've been discussing subconscious neurological process, and the brain has to have inputs to process, and those are provided by our nervous system. And because the discussion is dealing with subconscious processing, then it's the autonomic nervous system that we're dealing with. And the autonomic nervous system is made up of two very important and inseparable streams of information, those being sympathetic and parasympathetic inputs. And these streams of information directly affect our health and well-being, both positively and negatively. Well, sympathetic inputs are considered avoidance survival inputs, and they align with exciting. Conversely, parasympathetic inputs are considered approach pleasure inputs, and they align with beauty, as shown in this graphic. Well, following from that are some very important health attributes to be aware of here. So regarding sympathetic inputs, they are called sympathetic because these inputs are sympathetic to the fact that all bodily functions and resources should be temporarily diverted to the muscle groups that will enable survival. Thus, survival systems are at peak activation during a sympathetic event. Additionally, during a sympathetic event, non-essential systems are turned off, including reproduction, immune system, and cell repair. It's known as fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Characteristics of a sympathetic event are danger, stress, stimulation, and an anxiety, which aligns with survival and avoidance. The two primary hormones released during a sympathetic event are adrenaline to activate the systems necessary for survival, and cortisol released to slow down non-survival systems. Incidentally, cortisol is known as the stress hormone. The event initiates a raised heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and narrows your mental focus. Well, stress also affects our DNA and longevity of life for University of California researchers. So sympathetic inputs not only make us feel ill, they are a downward pull on our general health and sense of well-being. Regarding parasympathetic inputs, this is about pleasure and approach. It's known as rest and relaxation, or rest and digest. The characteristics of a parasympathetic event are calming, stress relieving, feeling a sense of well-being. The primary hormones released during a parasympathetic event are endorphins, which is the feel-good hormone, dopamine, and oxytocin. The event initiates a lower heart rate, lower blood pressure, optimizes critical functions and immunity, optimizes cell repair, activates multiple lobes in the brain, which is when insights happen, and it counters neuroinflammation, creates a general sense of well-being. For those of you that practice meditation, it's parasympathetic inputs that you're seeking to access. So parasympathetic inputs not only make us feel good, they boost the general state of our health. So the core message here is that our ancient subconscious brain is making decisions for us all day, every day, based on approach and avoidance patterns that we encounter in our field of vision. And there are strong and clear health ramifications to the patterns we encounter, both positively and negatively. Concisely, what we experience visually directly affects our health and well-being. Okay, so that concludes the first segment of today's talk, which has been focused on neuroscience concepts. This leads us to the second phase of today's talk, how patterns are linked to beauty. As our work was progressing on the subject of neuroscience, we also started to observe a correlation in our work between the statement, "It's beautiful," and the utilization of a 3x3 geometric pattern, sometimes referred to as a 9-square pattern. And here's an example of a home we designed just here outside of Denver. And what was interesting is people were calling it beautiful when it was just a plywood box. So you could tell where the windows and doors would be, and the roof form was, just nothing more than plywood. There were no finishes whatsoever. And people were walking by and commenting, "Welcome to the neighborhood. We can tell your home's going to be beautiful." So we knew there had to be some kind of pattern within the overall idea that was generating our concept. We wondered if this could possibly be related to the 3x3 pattern. Now, before we go on, here's a brief description of the concept of the 3x3 pattern that we're working with. As shown by this graphic, it's a division that has a left center right component and a top center bottom. Basically, it's a center that's surrounded by boundaries. And because our brains are so good at reading patterns, the overall idea from our point of view does not have to be symmetrical. Thus, the divisions do not have to be equal. Additionally, the 3x3 can be applied at different layers simultaneously. Here we're showing an elevation of a living room wall, 2 columns and a fireplace, and notice that descending 3x3 divisions start with the large segments and descend to the smaller element. So with this in mind, we did a search of iconic, beautiful art and architecture worldwide, and what we found was absolutely remarkable. Now, what's important to realize here is that these buildings and works of art are honored and exalted by societies worldwide. We protect these buildings. They're destinations of our travel. They're a focus of our scholarship, and they're objects of our affection. Well, here are just a few notable examples of, quote, beautiful buildings. Of course, the Parthenon, which is a World Heritage Site, is often referred to as the most beautiful building in ancient Greece. Incidentally, the red lines on the elevation align with the sidewalls of the internal naos, and the plan view shows the internal arrangements, a series of 3x3 diagrams. The Parthenon, another World Heritage Site, often called the most beautiful building in ancient Rome. And again, the elevation is a series of 3x3 compositions, as is the famous marble floor. Villa Rotunda, often referred to as the most beautiful residence built during the Renaissance. Again, Palladio certainly made his career with the 9 square, and here are just a few examples of that. The Taj Mahal, yet another World Heritage Site, often referred to as the most beautiful example of Islamic architecture on the Indian continent. It's a literal symphony of 3x3 patterns, including tile patterns. The Forbidden City in China, referred to as the most beautiful building in ancient China. Incidentally, we trace the pattern back to 5000 BC in China. The 3x3 is known as the magic square. That's 5000 BC, that's 2000 years before the pyramids. A building you're well aware of, the US Capitol, it's a literal symphony of 3x3 patterns. These are just a few of them. Knowledge, beautiful architectural icon to the world. Dealing with artwork, Woman in Gold by Gustav Klimt, often called the most beautiful modern painting in Western art. And note the asymmetry of the divisions. Also want to point out that Michelangelo, Botticelli, Rothko, Hopper, Wyeth, Georgia O'Keeffe, Clifford Still, Claude Monet, all use this same model. And of course, the Mona Lisa by Da Vinci, generally regarded as the most beautiful painting in Western art. Well, we wondered why there would be such a strong correlation between the emotion of beauty and the 3x3 pattern. And our research took us unexpectedly into face recognition science. And it comes back to this. The two drivers of the human condition, emotion and the emotions of survival and pleasure. When a child is born, 65% of the neuronal structure of the newborn is dedicated to facial recognition. As Charles Darwin stated, the child must find a face to survive. Well, that child is also genetically driven to engage with the face, which results in bonding and pleasure. Again, those are the two drivers in action from the first moments of birth, survival and pleasure. Well, because upon birth, the survival instinct is so strong, the child is frantically looking up and down, left and right, everywhere, searching for this image. A human facial pattern consisting of 3 dark areas defined by a light outline. This is the pattern that initially equals survival for the child. It also equals pleasure, it turns out. Again, those being the two fundamental drivers. So on the left here is what a child sees when first born and for a period of months thereafter. So note the 3 dark spots, 2 eyes and a mouth. Well, the graphic in the center shows a geometric representation of the 3 dark spots. We refer to this as upper left, upper right, bottom center. And the right-hand graphic shows the completion of the 3x3 pattern. Well, here's a 3x3 pattern overlaid onto a traditional building, just a random building that we selected, and then the transition to the same grid overlaid onto a face. Clearly, the building pattern and the facial pattern are similar. Also note the 2 windows up high and the ground level door. This is the upper left, upper right, and bottom center pattern. Well, why is this important? Because a child, during the process we call bonding, learns to associate the facial pattern with feelings of love and pleasure. And additionally, through this important development stage, the child is also developing a sense of empathy, which is important because it is setting up the vehicle by which the child will project their emotions into objects that contain this pattern. To quote Ellen Dissanayake from the book Art and Intimacy, Newborns come into the world with sensitivities and capacities that predispose them to join an emotional community with others. These same sensitivities and capacities are later used and elaborated in the rhythms and modes of adult love, art, and architecture. Well, this led us to look into an important neurological development that occurs in the newborn. Bonding activates the neuronal path known as the mesolimbic reward pathway. And this pathway serves as the neurological conduit that activates the release of endorphins into the bloodstream, creating a sense of pleasure. Thus, for the rest of our lives, if a 3x3 pattern is perceived as approachable by the viewer, then it will initiate the empathic transference of emotions into the art and architecture that includes this pattern. This is why we place so much importance on our beautiful art and architecture, because it's composed of the 3x3 pattern that represents our genetic drive to seek pleasure. Well, this finding led us to the important connection between pleasure and our health and well-being. This information led us to biology and psychology. A healthy nervous system achieves balance when the flow of sympathetic and parasympathetic inputs are in balance. It's known as homeostasis. A life that's all sympathetic and stressful is out of balance, as we know. Likewise, a life that's all parasympathetic and pleasure is equally out of balance. Stress makes us stronger, and pleasure mitigates the negative components of stress. It is literally a balancing act where one input complements the other. A good example of this is a stressful workout at the gym, followed by a cooling down period. So in a recent article in the New York Times, a leading research doctor at Columbia placed homeostasis as the #1 most important criteria for health and well-being. Well, applying the same balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic to design, we have this diagram indicating the importance of the utilization of design patterns that generate both parasympathetic and sympathetic reactions. Concisely, this advocates that it is essential that both exciting and beautiful elements be combined in a design to achieve the proper balance to reinforce health and well-being. Now, keep in mind, as discussed earlier, sympathetic inputs are much stronger than parasympathetic, so it doesn't take many of those inputs to properly balance the equation. Again, as mentioned earlier, parasympathetic inputs are those that are generated during meditation. Literally, a design can and does generate the same reaction in the autonomic nervous system as a meditation session if the correct patterns are utilized and homeostasis is achieved. Medical science has researched meditation closely for many years, and the health benefits derived from a parasympathetic state of mind are well documented. One of the primary benefits of parasympathetic inputs is it leads to improved brainwave function, which initiates improved cardiovascular coherence, which is an important initiator of stress relief and our general health and well-being. Parasympathetic inputs are also, they allow our brain to continue to grow and renew, which is called neuroplasticity, which counteracts neuroinflammation. This in turn helps us to ward off many diseases, including dementia, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. Well, conversely, an unbalanced accentuation of exciting and sympathetic patterns results in a diagram such as this, which leads to increased stress and a compromised immune and cardiovascular system, which can lead ultimately to catastrophic health ramifications, including hypertension, high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, and cancer are all connected to stress. This in turn affects our autoimmune system, creating opportunities for autoimmune diseases. Additionally, stress affects our very structure of our and that can possibly alter the length of our lives. Clearly, a situation that we should strive to avoid. And concerningly, this is where much of our architectural design rests worldwide today, with the emphasis on creating only exciting and sympathetic inputs with little or no thought given to creating beautiful parasympathetic inputs. Well, returning to the room I showed you earlier, this is a good example of avoidance reaction overriding the approach reaction. There's some comfortable furniture here, arranged in an identifiable pattern, but the overall geometry is unrecognizable, creating a stressful sympathetic reaction. Remember the picnic table with the lightning in the background? This composition has the same makeup. Few parasympathetic inputs, completely dominated by stress-inducing sympathetic inputs. Concisely, this room would not be good for the occupant's health and well-being. Then returning to the other room I featured, this room is filled with patterns we recognize, including the 3x3 pattern, the upper left, upper right, and bottom center pattern. And this room is sending a continuous stream of pleasure and parasympathetic inputs. Soft light, recognizable geometry, flowers, and water. All of these elements send subliminal approach pleasure signals. Concisely, this room would be good for the occupant's health and well-being. Spending time in this room would actually be very similar to a meditation session, generating coherent brain waves that activate multiple systems in our body that complement health and well-being. So returning to the home I showed earlier, the transference of the emotion of pleasure into a building elevation is a subconscious empathic event that results in the proclamation, "It's beautiful," when the correct patterns are in view. So note the 3x3, that's the facade composition. Also note the two chimneys in the front door / portico. This is the upper left, upper right, bottom center pattern. And these are the patterns the observers were instinctually reacting to as they walked by and exclaimed, "Welcome to the neighborhood. Your house is beautiful." Well, this brings me to the third segment of today's talk, a definition of beauty founded on neuroscience principles. Beauty has, for over a century, been considered to be in the eye of the beholder, that is, a personal preference decided only by one's experiences and judgments. Well, that was before the advent of the neural revolution. Now there's clear understanding that instinctual beauty is in fact a neurological event, originating from the ancient brain as an emotion that transitions into a feeling affecting the modern brain. And those emotions at the most fundamental level are common to everyone because of our common genetic evolutionary history. So building on the concepts I've discussed, survival, avoidance inputs, and pleasure approach inputs, this leads us to a definition of beauty. It's fundamentally a three-step process that we go through to call something beautiful. First, the brain contains chemicals that create an appetite for pleasure, and this fuels the mind's eagerness to search out new experiences. This is known as curiosity. If your curiosity should uncover a pattern that is recognizable and supports a pleasure approach reaction, then this leads to step 2, which is anticipation. And this is when the mesolimbic reward pathway is activated. This results in the release of several chemicals, including, as I mentioned earlier, dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins into your bloodstream, resulting in a feeling of well-being. This leads to step 3, which is the feeling of pleasure. That feeling of pleasure results in the proclamation, "It's beautiful." Now, it's not a single cycle, though. It's circular. Should the image be rich in multiple patterns, much like the living room wall elevation I showed you, then you will go through the cycle again, and the result is it's really beautiful. And then again, this is incredibly beautiful. And then again, unbelievable. And then finally, I'm at a loss for words. because at that point, your system is so full of endorphins that support your health and well-being that you don't know how to process it. To quote Professor Harry Francis Mulgrave, beauty is a neurological activity, an urge for and feeling of pleasure emanating from the brain's lowest or most primal reaches. Concisely, instinctual beauty is defined as a physical reaction to patterns that your brain recognizes subliminally as being safe and pleasurable. Well, I know many watching today are committed to beauty, and this is such important work you're doing, more important than you might realize. You are literally supporting and improving the overall health of society, and your clients as well. Here's a suggestion. The next time a client pulls out a red pen and starts marking up your drawings, you might bring up the fact that their health and well-being is at stake and that they would do well to follow your lead. Not only will it improve their lives, it may very well extend their life. It is that important. And additionally, tell your clients, not only is it good for your health, beauty is free, why wouldn't we use it? So I do want to note that this talk is focused only on the facial 3x3 pattern. There are other patterns that humankind evolved with that are equally powerful. Patterns from nature and curvatures from the human body, to name two. And our other senses are involved as well. And all of that will be left for another day to go over in another lecture. Also, I will add that this is not an issue of what style to select. Patterns that support parasympathetic inputs and beauty can be a component of any style, as I attempted to show today. Rather, this is a quality of life issue and a public health issue. Science is pointing the way to understanding the emotion of beauty, and we should use this knowledge to better our world. Our clients' health and well-being will be the better for it. So I've written a book that details this theory with the supporting science, which I really didn't have time to elaborate on today. And the book's available through Amazon. We also have a full-length documentary movie in the works, which will be shown on national PBS and at film festivals, which will feature the international opera star Renee Fleming. And the title is Built Beautiful, so keep an eye out for that. In closing, I will say, when someone compliments something in your life as being beautiful, you should take a moment to reflect on the fact that you are improving their health and well-being at that very moment. Beauty does matter to our lives, and neuroscience has opened the door for us to step through again. Let's take advantage of this opportunity to make the world a more beautiful place. Now, for the final piece of today's talk, I will present a short video that spans 5,000 years of architectural history, featuring almost every major continent on Earth. Many of the buildings shown are deemed iconic. Many use new construction techniques of their day. Many were considered cutting-edge design. Some are stone, some are wood, some are glass and steel. Yet despite this great diversity, they all share one single unique quality. They are all called beautiful. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the film.
Thank you, Don. That was wonderful, and I don't know if anybody else is getting stir crazy like me after seeing all those beautiful buildings. I'm ready to be able to travel again and go see things in real life. Um, we'll now have a brief Q&A if there's anybody who has any questions for Don, or if you feel less comfortable,
Just email me.
I can put our emails too in the chat.
I can ask.
Okay.
How do we do that?
Well, okay. If nobody has any questions or anything like that, I did put. Oh, go ahead.
Me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Salo Levina, and thank you for the lecture. What I saw that most of it, or almost 100%, 99% of all your examples is about symmetry. Even when you show patterns that are asymmetrical, very little ones, they were symmetrical, asymmetrical. So it's like always a very safe position for a designer to go to this kind of symmetrical situation. And I think that even when you talk about painters, like Rocco as a model, you don't talk about Picasso. That is not a symmetrical position. The same in architecture. So I think that all those things are the beauty, in this case, you're showing like a very safe environment and nothing that challenges. So this is kind of, for me, a little the trouble, because we're living in a world today that we are looking for more excitement than just a safe place that can bring you also beauty and peace. Do you understand my question?
I'm so sorry. I don't think my speakers here are very good. I was having an awfully difficult time understanding you. So it's not that I don't understand the question. I simply couldn't hear.
Yes.
I'm quite
Can you hear me better now? Hello?
Sorry, we're just turning the speakers up over here. There's a lot of reverb.
I'm so sorry.
Can you hear me?
A little bit better. It's a little fuzzy.
I don't know.
This is the problem with the new Zoom technology. It's a work in progress.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Well, I can, but I'm having a very difficult time understanding. It's just the clarity of your voice, and it has to do with the speakers on my TV, I believe. So I'm really, if you could perhaps email me.
There's chat in the chat. If there's anything that people want to ask in the chat or via email, I think that's probably the best option.
Yeah, if anybody's having any difficulty, I can read any questions aloud in the chat that were put in the chat platform. Nina says, I think he was asking if places that inspire excitement can also bring pleasure or peace.
Yes, well, certainly peace would be part of a pleasure response. I mean, certainly it doesn't fall into the survival category, and neuroscience has bifurcated our inputs genetically into either survival or pleasure. So peace would be creating a stress-free reaction. And it's very similar to coherent brain waves, coherent cardiovascular performance, all occur when you feel at peace. And that's an important part of pleasure. And I tried to touch on some of those components when I was talking about parasympathetic and meditation. So feeling at peace is really, it's a preferred way that you would like to experience your life. So certainly it's in the pleasure category.
All right. Let's see. Iliad asks, most examples were symmetrical. What about chaos and tension as examples of beauty?
So asymmetry is certainly not a deal breaker. It doesn't have to be symmetrical. Our brain is very good about discerning patterns. The important thing is, and what neuroscience is going to have to tease out here in research, and there are many labs and organizations working on this around the world, so it's not just me talking about this. What we have to tease out is where is the stress threshold? If it's too asymmetrical, and does the brain have a hard time processing? And difficulty in neurological processing equals stress. And that's what we need to try to avoid, because stress literally creating neuroinflammation is quite bad for our health. So we don't really know, just how far we can push the asymmetry, but I believe that asymmetry is not a deal breaker. that we certainly can have beauty with asymmetrical compositions. And Klimt's painting is a really good example. And most of Monet's paintings are based on an underlying 3x3 grid, but they're all asymmetrical. So.
Sorry about my keyboard clatter, everybody. Let's see, were there any other questions on in here? There was one about the soundtrack. I believe that was answered, but what was the soundtrack that you guys used in your video?
That's by a young composer. He lives in Britain named Max Richter, and he has a remarkable body of work. And so that soundtrack is from, hold on, can't remember which album it was from. Yeah, well, it was on the movie, but I'm sorry, but Max Richter would be the composer.
Okay. Emre says it's from Arrival. Maybe that's the one.
Yes.
There you go. Okay. So I have no further questions in the chat. Did anybody want to ask any questions?
Okay.
Oh, here's one. Do you describe Pauline Brown's concept of the other AQ, aesthetic intelligence, the importance of teaching in schools? Or do you subscribe to the Pauline Brown, sorry, concept of the other AQ?
I'm not sure if I do or don't because I'm not aware of it. So I apologize. I will look that up though. And if you want to email me, I will, I'll give you an answer to that.
And on that note, Don's email is in the chat. I'll put it back at the bottom since I think it's gotten a little buried. My email is also in there, and I'll put that again at the bottom, just in case anybody else has any other questions. But thank you again, Don. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the first Kohler Signature Store by GROF USA CEU. We're very excited to have had this opportunity to work with you, Don, and make some new friends and see some new faces. So thank you, everybody. I very much appreciate your. Andy says that she has a question. Sorry. Go ahead, Andy. Oh, let's see. What about beauty in the modern architecture?
Well, one of my statements in the lecture was this is really not about style. So I believe, if you use the 3x3 pattern, or as I mentioned, curvatures from the human body or fractals, which are patterns from nature, you can engender a reaction of that's beautiful in modern architecture. In the short video, I included the Farnsworth House. That's called the most beautiful example of modern architecture in the United States by Paul Goldberger. So he's responding to the fact that Farnsworth is based on a 3x3 pattern. So much of Richard Meyer's work, he used the 3x3 quite often. So I think that it really isn't about modern or traditional. I think what's important to realize here is that the teaching of modern architecture has moved away from accentuating patterns that mankind evolved with. And so we're used to seeing them over millions of years, those patterns, and deciphering them neurologically is less stressful. So by creating new patterns in modern architecture, we're actually creating stress for our brain to try to decide what is it and is it a safe or approachable. So anyway, modern architecture doesn't preclude using the pattern, nor does it include a beauty reaction.
Andy says, thank you. And then I have one further question. Anything to say about functionality and beauty?
Yes, right. Well, so beauty would be the result of composing how you solve the functionality question. So you would want to use a pattern that, again, that we're used to seeing. So the two certainly go hand in hand, or can and should, because I think, you know, what we've seen too often in recent decades is that we solve the problem from a functional point of view, but we don't go far enough and include the composition that includes patterns that will engender a parasympathetic reaction, which is stress relieving. And so what we're actually doing by just focusing on solving the functionality is that we may be creating more stress. Now, so while we solve the functional problem, we're actually engendering a stress reaction, which is more on the sympathetic side of the input equation. So I think the two have to go hand in hand, and I think you solve something from a functional point of view, but you do so in a way that utilizes patterns that mankind will react positively to.
All right. Well, thank you again, Don. Thank you, all of you, for being able to join us today. If anybody wants to submit an AIA number, you can email me. I have put my email in the chat again, as well as Don's email for any further questions for him. But I think those were all of the questions that were sent through the chat.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, everyone.
Lecture.
And thank you for all the comments in the chat. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.